The Weddell Sea stretches in silence, a vast expanse of ice and water at the edge of the Antarctic continent. In the austral summer of 1914, the sea was already littered with drifting ice floes, some thin and fractured, others dense and unyielding. The horizon was indistinct, a seamless line where sky and ice met beneath a pale, low sun. Wind moved steadily across the frozen surface, carrying with it the faint, sharp scent of the sea and snow. The temperature hovered well below freezing, and the air carried a constant stillness, punctuated only by the occasional groan of shifting ice or the distant crack of a berg breaking apart. The Endurance, a wooden ship reinforced for polar conditions, floated cautiously amid the ice. Its black hull contrasted with the white expanse, a small island of human presence in an otherwise unbroken wilderness. The waters around it were deep and hidden beneath sheets of ice, their depths uncertain and cold. Icebergs drifted slowly, their sculpted surfaces glinting in the diffuse light. Each morning, the crew would observe the movement of the pack, noting changes that might affect the ship's position. The isolation was absolute. No other vessel, no distant settlement, existed within sight. The Antarctic coast rose in jagged snow-covered ridges, remote and unyielding. The occasional seal slid across the ice, indifferent to the intruder in their domain. Days passed in near monotony, the quiet broken only by routine tasks aboard the ship. At this stage, there was no urgency, no indication of the trials that would soon define the men's survival. For now, the expedition existed within a frozen stillness, the vast Weddell Sea stretching beyond comprehension. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914 to 1917 was conceived as one of the most ambitious undertakings of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Led by Sir Ernest Shackleton, the goal was to cross the Antarctic continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, traversing approximately 1,800 miles of largely uncharted ice. Shackleton had already gained experience in polar expeditions, most notably with Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery Expedition 1901-1904 and his own Nimrod Expedition 1907 to 1909. His leadership had been tempered by close observation of the demands imposed by extreme environments, and he assembled his crew with careful attention to skill, experience, and temperament. The Endurance carried 28 men, a combination of officers, sailors, scientists, and a photographer. Each had a specific role: navigating, managing the ship, maintaining equipment, hunting, or recording observations. The men came from varied backgrounds: seamen with years of polar experience, engineers familiar with steam machinery, and scientists trained in geology, meteorology, and zoology. Among them, Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, was renowned for his navigation under difficult conditions. While expedition photographer Frank Hurley had already faced Antarctic winters and knew the challenges of preserving equipment in the cold. The crew also included versatile hands capable of adapting to tasks beyond their formal training, a necessity for survival in an environment with no room for redundancy. Preparation for the journey was meticulous. The ship was reinforced with dense oak and diagonal bracing to withstand ice pressure. Provisions included preserved meat, biscuits, pemmican, and other non-perishable foods calculated to last for several years if rationed. Clothing and sleeping gear were designed for polar conditions: furs, wool layers, and boots insulated against frostbite. Shackleton emphasized self-sufficiency. Each man carried skills essential to the group's collective survival, from hunting seals and penguins to navigating using sextants and compasses. The expedition's motivation combined scientific inquiry with exploration. Crossing Antarctica had never been achieved, and the journey promised to fill gaps in geographical knowledge. Scientific observation would record meteorological, geological, and biological data. At the same time, the venture embodied the era's values of endurance, courage, and human perseverance against nature. Shackleton's meticulous planning reflected an understanding of these pressures. The ship, provisions, and crew were all intended to support months of isolation and the possibility of extreme delay. By the time the Endurance departed from the coast of South Georgia in December 1914, the crew was aware of the harshness of the environment they would face, though few could fully anticipate the severity of the Weddell Sea's winter. The expedition left behind populated ports, regular communication, and any possibility of immediate aid. What lay ahead was an expanse defined by ice, shifting pack flows, and the constant uncertainty of weather. At this stage, the men were confident in their preparation, observing the frozen horizon with methodical attention, unaware that the Weddell Sea would soon become a test of endurance in a form few had ever faced. By January 1915, the Endurance had advanced into the northern reaches of the Weddell Sea. The pack ice, ever shifting and dense, began to close around the ship. At first, movement was slow. Small floes pressed against the hull, causing occasional groans from the timbers. The crew monitored the ice daily, noting the patterns of pressure ridges and the drift of larger floes. Conditions were not yet dangerous, but they were changing. By late January, the pressure had increased. Large sheets of ice collided against the ship's reinforced hull. The Endurance was no longer free to navigate open water. The ice gripped it, holding it fast. Shackleton and Worsley recorded the phenomenon in their logs. Without exaggeration, the ship was immobilized, drifting with the ice rather than moving under its own power. The Weddell Sea, for all its apparent stillness, had become a vast, shifting trap. The crew's initial response was measured daily routines continued aboard the ship. Maintenance, observation, record-keeping, there was no immediate panic. Officers and men alike treated the ice as an obstacle, one to be monitored and documented. Yet, the first signs of long-term isolation were unmistakable. The ship's drift was unpredictable. Storms could press the ice further, increasing pressure on the timbers. Escape through conventional navigation was no longer certain. Within days, it became evident that the Endurance would not break free under its own power. Shackleton noted that the ice was thickening, the drift carrying them further northward but offering no clear path to open water. The moment of unavoidable isolation had arrived. The crew could no longer rely on movement or access to the mainland. From this point forward, survival depended on adaptation to the ice itself. The first tension was subtle but persistent. The environment had shifted from a navigable sea to a confining landscape. The crew's skills, preparation, and cohesion would be tested not against distant hazards, but against the ice immediately surrounding them. The Weddell Sea had become an indifferent arbiter, shaping the conditions of survival with slow, inexorable pressure. Shackleton's expedition, at this point, transitioned from exploration to endurance. The limits of human activity now measured against the immutable forces of polar nature. By October 1915, the Endurance had succumbed entirely to the pressure of the Weddell Sea ice. The timbers creaked under the relentless force, and on the 27th of October, the ship was finally crushed, leaving the crew without its protection. Shackleton ordered the men onto the ice, hauling what could be salvaged: tents, food supplies, boats, and essential equipment. The environment they faced was stark, a flat, shifting expanse of broken ice interspersed with open water leads. Temperatures were consistently below freezing, and the wind carried a cutting chill. Daily life on the ice became a matter of strict routine. Each morning began with the assessment of ice conditions and the selection of a suitable camp. Shackleton and his officers determined where to pitch tents or establish temporary shelters using the lifeboats as windbreaks. The men worked together to haul supplies over uneven ice surfaces, improvising sledge systems when necessary. Camps were placed near stable floes, but even these could shift unpredictably, threatening tents and supplies. Movement required vigilance. The ice could fracture or open without warning. Food was rationed carefully. The stores salvaged from the Endurance included preserved meats, biscuits, and tinned goods, but these were finite. Supplementing these supplies required hunting local wildlife. Seals and penguins provided the bulk of protein. Men were assigned to observation and hunting shifts. Using makeshift tools and small firearms, they collected what they could without overextending themselves. Meat was preserved by freezing, and occasional blubber was rendered for fuel. Water was obtained by melting ice in small quantities over portable stoves, a constant task that required attention to conserve fuel. Shelter remained essential. Tents were erected against windward edges of floes or behind the lifeboats hauled onto the ice. Snow walls provided additional protection against prevailing winds. Men slept in layers of furs and wool, insulated by the ice itself and by shared body heat in particularly harsh conditions. The daily struggle was not only against cold, but also against exhaustion. The act of simply maintaining position on the ice demanded physical labor from dawn until dusk. Mental discipline was equally crucial. Shackleton imposed strict schedules, organizing duties to prevent lethargy or despair. Crews rotated through hunting, camp maintenance, and watch duties, ensuring that each man remained engaged. Timekeeping became a measure of normality. The crew tracked days through routine tasks, log entries, and meal cycles. They measured drift by recording positions and observing the movement of distant icebergs. These methods prevented the complete loss of temporal orientation in an otherwise featureless landscape. Adaptation extended to hygiene and health. Frostbite, minor injuries, and fatigue were constant concerns. The men monitored each other, adjusting clothing and treating early signs of injury. Physical conditioning remained vital, as even short excursions across the ice could be exhausting. Stoves were used to prepare small meals, and boiling water for hygiene, though limited fuel, required prioritization. Shackleton's leadership emphasized consistency. Disorder or improvisation beyond necessity increased the risk of injury or exposure. Despite the monotony, observation continued. Shackleton and Hurley documented the ice, wildlife, and daily life, creating records of both scientific and practical value. The movement of floes was tracked meticulously, noting pressure ridges, cracks, and leads of open water. These records informed decisions about when and where to relocate camps and when to prepare the lifeboats for possible departure. Every action was deliberate. Survival demanded forethought, precision, and patience. Over time, the crew adapted to the environment. Physical routines became second nature, hunting skills improved, and the men learned to read subtle changes in ice stability. The psychological effect of repeated isolation was mitigated by constant activity and structured schedules. Communication was clear and practical, focused on immediate needs and risks rather than speculation. The crew remained vigilant, observing each other and the ice, aware that a single misstep could have catastrophic consequences. By mid-1916, the Endurance floes had drifted northward, creating an opportunity. The ice had thinned in certain areas, offering leads of open water. Shackleton considered the possibility of leaving the ice altogether. Preparations began in earnest. Lifeboats were reinforced, provisions organized, and clothing adjusted for open boat exposure. Yet the decision to move was calculated, not impulsive. Survival depended on understanding the conditions of the ice, the weather, and the men themselves. The transition from static life on floes to an open-sea voyage would require the discipline and strategies honed over months of rigorous adaptation. The crew's daily existence on the ice was defined by observation, labor, and the quiet endurance of extreme conditions. Every action was measured against the potential for disaster. There was no room for error, and the environment offered neither comfort nor reprieve. Yet, within this framework, the men established a functional, sustainable pattern of life. The ice, indifferent and relentless, shaped not only their physical activity, but also the structure of thought and behavior. Shackleton's meticulous planning, combined with the crew's adaptability, allowed survival where chance alone might have failed. By April 1916, Shackleton determined that remaining on the ice floes was no longer sustainable. The ice was breaking apart and drifting further north, and the possibility of wintering indefinitely on unstable floes carried extreme risk. The decision was made to attempt a voyage in the lifeboats to a distant refuge, Elephant Island. The plan required meticulous preparation. Provisions were salvaged from the frozen stores, boats were reinforced with planking and tarpaulin, and clothing was adjusted for exposure to wind, spray, and freezing temperatures. The crew faced the Weddell Sea in open boats, wooden vessels designed for ship-to-shore transport, not extended ocean voyages. The first challenge was navigating through ice-backed waters. The flows were unpredictable, opening suddenly into leads of water or closing rapidly. Shackleton's orders emphasized patience and caution. Crews had to haul the boats over smaller ice sheets, waiting for openings to row through. The temperature was consistently below freezing, and each man carried heavy clothing and survival gear. Any contact with water could be like. Once free of the immediate ice fields, the voyage became a test of endurance on open water. The boats were exposed to high seas, strong winds, and frequent storms. Waves swept over the decks, soaking men and supplies. Shackleton and his officers rotated duties continuously. Men rowed in shifts, maintaining course and stability. Navigation relied on a sextant and compass, with readings taken whenever the sun appeared. Visibility was often limited by snow, fog, or low clouds, making precise navigation difficult. The crossing covered approximately 800 miles, a journey that would take 16 days to complete. Food and water were scarce. Rations consisted primarily of hard biscuits, chocolate, and small portions of pemmican. Seal and penguin meat, collected from prior stops, supplemented these supplies, though availability was limited during the voyage. Fresh water was obtained by melting snow when possible, though this required labor and fuel. Exposure, combined with caloric restriction, tested the limits of the men's physical endurance. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant concerns, and each man's capacity for work depended on careful management of energy and vigilance against the cold. Shelter was improvised in the boats. Tarpaulins were rigged to reduce wind exposure, and men huddled together when weather forced pauses. Even during calmer periods, the sea remained unforgiving. The constant motion of the boats required balance and strength. Sleep was fragmented and brief, often taken in shifts of a few hours. Any lapse in attention could result in capsizing or loss of supplies. Crew members maintained watch continuously, observing both the horizon and the behavior of the sea. Despite these hardships, the crew maintained cohesion. Shackleton's leadership emphasized clear communication, strict rotation of duties, and mutual support. Men encouraged one another silently through coordinated effort rather than overt displays of morale. Decision-making was deliberate, each maneuver planned and executed with care. The journey demanded discipline and trust. Individual mistakes could imperil the entire party. After 16 days at sea, the boats approached Elephant Island, a remote and rocky outcrop in the southern Atlantic. Landfall offered no comfort. The island was uninhabited, windswept, and exposed. Yet reaching it marked the transition from the unpredictability of open water to a stationary location where shelter could be organized. The men hauled the boats ashore, erected tents behind rocky ridges, and established a minimal camp. Survival was still precarious, but the voyage demonstrated the value of preparation, endurance, and measured action under extreme conditions. The open boat voyage of the Endurance crew illustrates the intersection of human skill, planning, and environmental challenge. Navigation across hundreds of miles of polar sea, combined with limited provisions and exposure to relentless weather, required not only physical strength, but precise coordination and leadership. The men's survival depended on adhering to routines honed during months on the ice, managing fatigue, and responding consistently to an indifferent environment. The voyage to Elephant Island represents the longest and most exposed segment of their ordeal, a journey in which errors could have had immediate fatal consequences. Upon reaching Elephant Island in late April 1916, Shackleton's crew faced a harsh and unforgiving environment. The island was rocky, windswept, and largely uninhabited, with little vegetation and no permanent sources of fresh water. Its coastline consisted of jagged cliffs and small beaches, providing minimal shelter from the persistent winds and the Southern Ocean's waves. Although the island offered solid ground after months on ice and open water, it presented new challenges for survival. The crew established a camp at Point Wild, a narrow coastal area protected from the worst of the wind by boulders and a low ridge. Tents salvaged from the Endurance were pitched behind the rocks, and lifeboats were hauled further inland as additional protection. Space was limited, and the men slept in close proximity to conserve warmth. Exposure to cold and wet conditions remained a daily concern. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant risks, mitigated only by layered clothing, careful rotation of duties, and strict adherence to rationed activity. Food remained scarce. Supplies from the lifeboats and what had been salvaged from the ice were carefully managed. Seal and penguin hunting continued, but the population was finite and the terrain challenging. Meals were small, measured portions, designed to stretch the limited stores over an indefinite period. Water was collected from melting snow or ice when available, but rain and fresh supplies were unreliable. The men relied on discipline and careful planning to avoid depletion of provisions, maintaining detailed records of consumption and reserves. Physical exhaustion was compounded by mental strain. The crew knew they were isolated. No other human presence existed within hundreds of miles, and the Southern Ocean could be unforgiving to any attempt at escape. Days blended into one another, marked by repetitive routines of camp maintenance, hunting, and observation. The monotony was punctuated only by the constant challenge of weather and terrain, and by Shackleton's careful oversight to maintain order and morale. Despite the severity of conditions, the men adapted to the environment. Duties were rotated, and a sense of shared responsibility reinforced cohesion. Shackleton emphasized vigilance. Any lapse in attention could result in injury or the loss of supplies. The crew measured time through the repetition of necessary tasks rather than external markers. They observed weather patterns, tidal movements, and wildlife, using these indicators to plan activities safely. Elephant Island was both a refuge and a confinement. The men survived the immediate dangers of the open sea and drifting ice, but their situation remained precarious. Isolation persisted, provisions were limited, and the island offered no prospect of rescue without external intervention. The psychological weight of waiting, combined with physical deprivation, tested the crew in ways that mirrored the demands of months on the ice, requiring discipline, cooperation, and patience for continued survival. With the crew of Elephant Island secure in a minimal camp, Shackleton faced the next phase of survival, reaching inhabited territory to arrange rescue. In late April 1916, he selected 5 men to accompany him on a voyage across 800 miles of open Southern Ocean to South Georgia, a whaling outpost in the South Atlantic. The journey required the use of the lifeboat, James Caird, reinforced for the voyage with extra planking and watertight sealing. The preparation was methodical. Provisions were rationed, navigation instruments checked, and clothing adapted for wind, spray, and freezing temperatures. The crossing demanded continuous vigilance. Waves frequently swept over the deck, soaking men and supplies. Shackleton and his crew rotated duties, maintaining the course and monitoring navigation. Sextant readings were taken whenever the sun appeared, though cloud cover often rendered precise calculations impossible. Exposure was constant. Men endured freezing temperatures, strong winds, and the motion of the boat in high seas. Sleep was fragmented, often measured in short intervals, while the demands of rowing, bailing water, and maintaining course never ceased. After 16 days at sea, the party made landfall on the uninhabited southern coast of South Georgia. From there, Shackleton and 2 companions traversed mountainous terrain to reach a whaling station on the northern shore. The journey involved steep ascents, icy slopes, and unpredictable weather, yet it proceeded without incident. Shackleton immediately organized rescue for the men remaining on Elephant Island. The expedition's return to inhabited areas marked the conclusion of the crew's immediate survival ordeal. No celebration or triumph was recorded. The emphasis remained on practical measures to restore the group to safety. The successful coordination of rescue highlighted the combination of careful planning, endurance, and methodical action that had sustained the men through months of isolation and exposure.